So I was recently sent a video by a user in which a relatively large apologetics channel forwarded Pascal's wager. Now generally Pascal's wager is so full of holes that even apologists recognise that and steer clear, so to see someone present said argument unironically and it be accepted hook, line and sinker by the vast majority of their viewers, scoring 995 likes is genuinely shocking. I speak of course of the video titled Why You Should Believe in God, Pascal's Wager by Ascension Presents, in which Matt Fradd presents us the truly dead relic of the past.
G'day, my name is Matt Fradd, and today I want to talk to you a little bit about Pascal's wager. This is an argument for belief in God that's very controversial, and there's a lot of YouTube videos and articles out there online saying that it's bunk, that it doesn't work. I think they're wrong. So today in this video, I just want to share the bare bone basics of what Pascal's wager is. And then I want to look at some of your objections or some of the objections that you've heard in the comment section. And then in another video, I will respond as best as I can to those objections. So who was Pascal? Pascal lived during the 17th century in France. He was an agnostic. He became a Christian. He fell into the heresy of Jansenism. Later on in his life, after a spiritual experience, he started to become, by and large, a faithful Catholic. And Pascal was working on a book on Christian apologetics. That just basically means a book that defends the faith or makes a positive case for the Christian faith. Unfortunately, Pascal died before he could publish the book, so his friends collected all of his notebooks, basically put it together and published that. So you can get that book today. It's called The Pensées. It's super great if you've got ADD or something similar like me, because you're just reading these basically thick tweets, as it were, from Pascal on his different thoughts on the Christian faith. One of the things that Pascal is most famous for is his wager. So what is that? Well, Pascal basically makes this argument. Either God exists or God does not exist. We have two responses, right, that we can possibly have towards God. We can believe, or we can be in a state of unbelief. There are no other options here, you understand. There's belief and unbelief, that's it. If I don't believe, then whatever else I do is going to be unbelief. And so for this reason, Pascal says this is a forced wager. You have to make a bet, because refraining from betting is itself a bet, because it is itself unbelief. So what are you going to do? Well, Pascal wasn't a big fan of metaphysical arguments for the existence of God, such like we find in Thomas Aquinas. Why? Well, he thought most people don't understand them, and even those who do understand them, later on, when they're not thinking about them, wonder if they've made a mistake or not. So suppose you or a friend is thinking to themselves, you know, I've looked at the arguments for atheism, and I've looked at the arguments for Christian theism, and I just can't tell which one is stronger. If you're like that, or if you have a friend like that, this is where Pascal's wager comes in handy, because it isn't an argument for the existence of God. It's an argument for why you should believe in God if reason can't decide. Right? If reason can't decide, then we can decide based on other factors, such as self-interest.
That's not how either philosophy or science operate. If you don't have reason to believe in X, then the only honest action is to withhold said belief. And this isn't something abstract. We see this in everyday life, such as with the court system. If I lack evidence to hold that a person is guilty, I should suspend that conclusion until I have evidence to once again re-examine my position. Likewise, if the theist cannot provide evidence that a God exists, which has been the case historically, the only intellectually honest position is withholding belief in said God. So already you've stuck a hole in your own argument in noting how this doesn't prove God, but is merely a thinly veiled threat hurled at the non-believer by the believer as an attempt at extortion.
So, what do we get if we bet on God? What do we lose if we bet on God and he doesn't exist? Okay, well, if God exists and I bet on him, that is to say, I believe in him, then Pascal says you gain everything, right? You gain virtue and happiness in this life and eternal happiness in the next.
Which is not true even giving you the assumption that there really is a God. Why? Well, because this conclusion assumes that said God is your God and not one of the countless thousands of gods that have been invented or a God humanity does not know of. This relates to point 2 of my 5 ways in which Pascal's wager fails. If you pick the wrong God, you risk even greater torture. Unlike the atheist, you have no defense in that your absence of belief was based in the absence of evidence, since you believed in one magical sky fairy over another, with no evidence. What's more is that said act of worship to the wrong God could be seen as a direct insult on the real God, much in the same way that we see Yahweh react to the worship of the golden calf in the book of Exodus. But for you it's worse than that, since you don't just worship, you preach. So even if a God exists, it does not follow that you will enter heaven. Only if your single God out of the countless others exist do you receive that. Meanwhile, with most other gods, you run the risk of punishment beyond that of someone who simply did not believe without evidence.
If God exists and I don't believe in him, then I'm going to basically be living an illusion. I'm going to be living as if God doesn't exist. It's going to be very difficult for me to be able to believe in things like objective beauty and morality and things like this.
Really? You can't just stick with one crappy and readily refuted argument, so you have to drag in others. This statement is one which lacks any and all basis. The existence of God does not lend itself to meaning, morality, or beauty as you put it. If a God exists, then their meaning is just as meaningless as yours. Their morality is just as subjective as yours. And the same is true as their standard of beauty. God existing does nothing to solve that problem, so pretending that this is something that only impacts a non-believer is inherently dishonest.
Pascal doesn't talk about hell, but I suppose we could extrapolate and say, well, if God exists and I don't believe him, then I run the risk of being damned for all eternity. Okay.
Only if God is unjust or ignorant by nature. Here you trip upon points 4 and 5 of my 5 ways in which Pascal's wager fails. Point 4 notes the fact that an all-knowing God would see the nature of one's belief. For a start, I don't believe this argument can actually convince a person to believe. Not deep down anyway. The best this can do is get a person to say and pretend that they believe, which may fool a preacher, but not an all-knowing God. But let's pretend like belief was a choice and this could impact it. An all-knowing God would surely see that my belief came not from having basis or even a desire to believe in them, but simply fear. Now only an ignorant God would not understand this, and only a cruel God would desire it. Building on from this with point 5, surely a just and all-knowing God faced with an atheist would be able to see into their heart and understand that their lack of belief came not out of malice. Surely an all-knowing God would know that I didn't believe because they gave no evidence, and a just God would accept this as a perfectly acceptable justification for not believing. Any other reaction to my existence by God would therefore paint them as either ignorant or, once again, cruel.
What if God doesn't exist? Well, if God doesn't exist and I bet on him, well, what do I lose? Well, you might first say, well, you lose a lot of things. I mean, you don't get to have different sexual experiences that you might want to have. You don't get to sleep in on Sunday mornings and things like that. But it's interesting to note that different Pew Research studies have shown that religious people who attend some sort of religious service once a week, tend to be happier. And we're even seeing people like Jordan Peterson, who doesn't appear to be a Christian, speaking of the benefits of belief in God. So you could say, well, even though I have to lose some of those things, in the end it ends up being a benefit anyway, because in believing in God, I'm becoming more virtuous, hopefully more charitable, more prudent, and that'll make for a more happy life. But if God doesn't exist, and I don't believe in him, well, I'm never going to know that anyway, because at the end of this life, I will just fall into oblivion. So Pascal says, so go ahead, believe in God. What are you waiting for? If God exists and you bet on him, you get everything. If God does not exist, and you bet on him, you lose nothing. So believe in God.
Jordan Peterson is a conservative Christian so far gone that he holds to the myth that atheists don't actually exist. So him parroting such crap about the benefit of religion is hardly surprising. Now it's true, there has been research that has shown that Christians on average are happier than atheists. In America. That fact is important because we have to look at the social background to atheism in the American context. Most importantly, the Cold War era and the Second Red Scare, which conflated both atheism and secularism with communism. Only in 2014, 13 years into the post-9/11 world, did Muslims surpass atheists as the most distrusted demographic in America. Yet this was only barely, and the same was true when the study was repeated in 2017. That distrust and hostility directly impacts the day-to-day lives of non-believers and how they are treated in society by both their families and beyond. They're constantly under attack in the news, told that their lives are meaningless, and that they have no place in what was one of the first constitutionally secular nations on the planet. Meanwhile, if you go across to Scandinavia and parts of Europe which have high levels of atheism, sometimes as high as 70% or even more, they beat theocratic nations in life fulfillment hands down, year after year, and they do that without harming the religious people. So yes, atheists in a religiously dominated nation suffer, whilst everyone benefits in a secular nation, secularism being the state-church separation which allows for both freedom of and freedom from religion. So your counter is flawed on that basis alone. But I'd like to go further since this is point one of how Pascal's wager fails. The fact that you have everything to lose. We have one life that we know of, and that life is limited. To squander that life in pursuit of one not known to exist is not a safe bet. It's being bought in by a con. It's no different to the Nigerian prince in your inbox, except you seek to lose literally everything known to exist, and that's sick and twisted.
Now, I know, as I said in the beginning of this film, that there are a lot of questions about this argument. So let me just address one of them. You might be thinking, this seems rather cheeky, doesn't it? I mean, you're only believing because of self-interest. Yeah, that's true, and Pascal was aware of that. But when you think about it, when the disciples preached the risen Christ, they were saying things like, come and receive eternal life. So it's not like Christianity is entirely devoid of this self-interestedness, right? We are saying to people, come and believe in God so that you will have eternal life, so that you will avoid damnation. Secondly, Pascal obviously doesn't want people who believe in God to have a superficial faith where they believe in him only because they're going to get something out of it. He wants them to go on from there to something greater and deeper and more serious. But I think we can agree, or should agree as Christians, that God stoops to conquer.
So you acknowledge the issue but do nothing to actually deal with it. It's like that crack about charity you made in the previous segment. Religious charity is rarely actual charity. It's typically self-serving in how religious people use the sandwich at ransom trick to score celestial brownie points they hope to redeem after death. They use the guise of charity to preach when really what they're doing is preying on the most vulnerable in society. So well done in fucking up there.
So there you are. That's the basic understanding of Pascal's wager. I'd love it if you'd like to leave me your comments below. Tell me what you think of the wager. If you have arguments against the wager, I'd love to read them too. And in a separate video, I'll respond to your comments.
Well, I checked to see at the time of recording and couldn't find the follow-up video. But I realised I didn't get the opportunity to make point 3 of why Pascal's wager fails, so I guess I should go ahead and do so now. Hell, by definition, is no worse than heaven. To elaborate on this one a little more, heaven is simply eternal slavery in honour of God, worshipping for all eternity like some battery pack until your very existence is dominated by nothing but said worship. How is that any worse than an eternity of torture until your existence is dominated by nothing but said torture? No infinite can be worse than any other. But at least in hell, if an unjust God does exist, I can starve the fucking bastard. Disagree? Well, I'd like you to mathematically argue how one eternity is worse than the other. So yeah, Pascal's wager is still dead as ever. Hi there, I'd just like to say a few things here at the end of the video before you go. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone who's ever donated to the channel via Patreon, giving a special thanks to the following people: Hannah Banghart, Matthew Kovac, John Schoenrock, Daniel Martinez, and Alexander Williams. Your support has ensured this channel its ability to grow over the years. I'd also like to ask that you comment down below and like this video, as well as subscribe, hit the bell icon, and follow Essence of Thought on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Please also consider following Atheists Alliance International on Facebook, a humanist organisation dedicated to helping atheists around the globe. Lastly, I'd like to request that you treat the people responded to in this video with a reasonable degree of respect. Whilst we understand that there are justifiable limits to said respect when tackling certain heavy topics and anger can be a very genuine emotion in fighting injustice, any comments utilising language which insults others on the basis of perceived gender, sexuality, ethnicity or ability both mental and physical will be removed immediately and the commenter may be blocked on the moderator's discretion. Let's work to keep this space one which upholds the values of humanism. Thank you.